This morning, the Wall Street Journal reported that Nintendo is supposedly working on a new model of the Switch dated for sometime next year, possibly as early as summer. Now, this is something that we have been long speculating about. I feel like almost as soon as a half a year after the original Switch came out, a lot of people were already wondering, well, what would they do if they made a new version? Whether that's a XL, a Pro, a Pocket, some kind of new version, what could they improve? Now, so far, based on what the Wall Street Journal is reporting, the only thing that's really been talked about from Nintendo is the idea of improving the screen with better LCD technology. The main two takeaways from it would be potentially better battery life and a brighter screen. But those kind of changes alone don't exactly justify an entire model refresh. So let's talk about what other changes Nintendo could possibly be making for a new Nintendo Switch. Now, when we're talking about the Switch, it's important to note that the Switch itself is really just the tablet portion of the system. I know oftentimes people picture it as one whole unit when it's in portable mode, but really, that's the Joy-Cons being attached to the Switch, and they're their own kind of separate thing, and that partially influences what Nintendo could potentially do with a new one. We'll get to that a little later, but for now, let's just talk about what kind of changes we could see happen with the main Switch body. First, we've already mentioned the fact that it sounds like Nintendo wants to give it a brighter screen, but another possibility is a larger screen as well. Now, it's not very likely that they'll increase the size of the Switch unit itself, because that kind of messes with the whole dynamic of having Joy-Cons that can slot onto the side unless they make large Joy-Cons, but then that's a whole thing with where the new stuff doesn't match up with the old stuff, and that's just a whole issue that I'm hoping doesn't happen. But assuming that it is maintaining the same general portions and sizes, it's still possible that we could get a larger screen size by reducing the bezel, because the bezel on the Switch is fairly large noticeable, so it is something that we could see a little bit bigger. Physically, another possible change that I would personally love to see, I mean, once again, this has always been one of the biggest nitpicky arguments about the Switch itself, but let's change the kickstand, please, somehow. Maybe something that doesn't quite as easily break off. I mean, I know the idea is that if it breaks off, it's easy to reinsert, but if that happens multiple times, it gets to the point where it's just this thing that doesn't sit right. Let's just overhaul that whole system, please. Now, physically, that's honestly it on my end for requests. Like I said, I don't think we can do things like make it a larger or smaller body, because then that gets into a whole territory of actually being a separate system from the current ecosystem. But there is some stuff internally we could change. For instance, I really would like to see just a bit more power in the system. I'm not talking about some kind of major overhaul where we're getting some kind of 4K supportive Switch, which would actually be really cool, but you know, something a little more realistic. I just want a little more power for the sake of just smoothness of gameplay. You know, there's a lot of games right now that aren't fully optimized for either portable or home. There are games where portable is great, and then if you're playing on docked mode, you're getting small frame rate reductions. There's other games where if you're in home mode, it looks great, but then if you're doing things handheld, there's resolution drops and just all kinds of issues. So we could just get just a little more power to even out a lot of those issues. I would really like that. Now, the other big question is what happens to the Joy-Cons themselves? Are we gonna see any kind of revision for those if there's a new Switch? Because once again, we still run into the same problem of if we want to make sure that any kind of new stuff still works with older current Switch stuff, they have to be roughly the same size still, or at least have the same kind of rail size to be able to attach to the side of the Switch. But there's another limitation to worry about with Joy-Cons as well, and that's Nintendo's obsession with the ability to use them as their own singular controller when held sideways. Because there's a lot of stuff that might make a lot of sense when you're using the Switch in handheld mode or using a pair of Joy-Cons at the same time that doesn't necessarily make sense for using a single Joy-Con on its own. Part of the reason why Joy-Cons aren't quite as comfortable as they potentially could be is because Nintendo wants you to be able to hold them like this or like this. But if, like I said, they drop the idea of having both those options available, a Pro option could offer a better, more contoured grip design that could make them way more comfortable in either situation where you're using two at once. Something that's a little more unlikely, but I think may be possible, is also adjusting the size of the Joy-Cons. Once again, you can't mess with it too much because you want to make sure that it can still work with modern systems. At least I hope that's something that Nintendo cares about. But all that really matters for Joy-Cons to slide onto the Switch itself is that the rail sizes match up. So as long as the rails are right, you could potentially make a larger Joy-Con as well for those people that find the smaller size to just be way too uncomfortable. Now, another big question is, if this actually is happening and we're getting a kind of revised Switch, what is it going to be called? Nintendo doesn't have a deep history of revising systems when it comes to their mainline consoles, but they have done a ton of revisions when it comes to handhelds, and based on what we've seen in the past with those, there's really kind of two forms of logic Nintendo uses. Either they take the simplest route possible and just call it something like the new version. For instance, if this new Switch has nothing noticeably super different about it, they could just call it the new Nintendo Switch. And honestly, I'm leaning to that being the most likely answer. However, something else that Nintendo has also done is if there's any kind of major, significant, noticeable change, they'll name it after that specific change, whether that's making it larger, calling it the Switch XL, making it smaller, calling it the Switch Pocket. If it offers 4K, they could call it the Switch 4K. Any kind of combination like that, depending on what that most significant change is, could influence the name. Look, there are a lot of things Nintendo could possibly do with a revised Switch, and I think everyone has their own little wish list of things they would like to see or think really need to change. Honestly, personally, I lean towards the idea that I really think Nintendo's probably going to be somewhat minimal with it. I don't think they're looking to radically change the design of the Switch or how it works. I think if anything, we're just going to see things like better battery life, brighter screens, hopefully larger screens, and just in general, some performance ups would be really nice. But we don't know yet. We're running off of very little right now, and hopefully we're going to find out more soon.